Ms Carey.
Thank you, my lady. Professor Harris, may I just finish off with a few questions in relation to the shielding? And you say in your statement that DHSE had overall responsibility for communication with both the CEV and CV cohort, and that Public Health England and subsequently UXA were mainly involved in the production of guidance. And I just would like your help about one piece of guidance. Can we turn to 410865_33, please?
Just while that's coming up, could I just go back? So overall, DHSC was not responsible for the whole shielding programme.
No.
They were responsible for the policy element of the clinical side of it.
Yes.
And the actual shielding guidance was, if I remember, was the responsibility of the Cabinet Office from May.
Well, I'm reading it from your paragraph 81, where you say they had overall responsibility for communication. It may be you misheard me.
On the clinical side of things,
right.
yes. So I think it's the fact that these are multifaceted elements.
All right, thank you very much for clarifying. Can I ask you, please, about the entry on your screen, I hope, for the 29th of September 2020? And there was some guidance given to the clinically extremely vulnerable from PHE, and it says it's updated to remove references to rates of transmission of coronavirus falling in response to user feedback. Are you able to help me with what the feedback was and why then the references were removed from the guidance?
I'm happy to check that after for you, but my suspicion would be that the rates rose and fell, and obviously the advice to come out of shielding would be when the rates were falling. But there were periods of time, and I think this is one where parts of the country were in different rates, so it was quite a confusing message.
Okay.
And so if an area was staying in a Tier 3 lockdown and the rest of the country was coming out, it wasn't a simple narrative to give.
Fine. Well, if you wouldn't mind checking that in case there is another reason why the guidance was updated as a result of user feedback, that would be helpful. Can I turn to a slightly different aspect of the shielding programme and the risks to clinically extremely vulnerable and clinically vulnerable people not accessing healthcare? In your statement, you deal with this at paragraph 103 onwards, and you say, if I may summarise, the CV group was strongly advised to use remote access. The CEV group were also advised to use remote access, but should speak to their GP or treating clinician to ensure they receive care. So slightly different advice. The inquiry heard from Dr. Cathy Finnis, who was a member of the Clinically Vulnerable Families core participant group, who told us that certainly the immunocompromised people were, at the time, and indeed perhaps still, cancelling or delaying healthcare appointments due to ongoing concerns about the risk of infection in the healthcare setting. And I just would like your help, if you're able to give it, as to what practical steps could be taken to ensure that the immunocompromised people, whether we're in a rate of high transmission or not, feel able to access healthcare services.
So, I mean, obviously I can't speak on their behalf, and I have heard many similar points of view. I think the reason that note was put in there was actually to assist them in getting care safely. There was a particular note at the start of the shielding programme that asked that if there was booked care already planned, these are individuals who would often have regular appointments and need to access care frequently, that they discussed how necessary that was with their GP, and also that they discussed with their GP in order that the GP might be able to advise on a safer way of doing something or advise on any precautions. So the reason for the difference was exactly to ensure that they were as safe as possible. In terms of messaging, I mean, I think communication, as I've already noted, has been really difficult throughout this. I think it was the same for many of the population. I myself had email messages actually from people who had accessed care and were going to discharge themselves, to the extent I actually stepped in on one, which was very unusual because of the fear of the virus at the time. And I think we can try and learn from people's experience for future episodes, but it's very difficult because people's perception of risk on top of the standard messaging is very individual as well.
But what will we, yes, we learn that it's difficult, but what do we learn that can be done differently?
So in terms of that, we did have Behavioural Insight group running, particularly for the CEV group. And so where that on a fairly regular basis, where that picked up something, we would try and feed it back into the guidance that was going out. There's also wider work going on, which UKHSA is involved with in terms of communications. So one of our communications team is actually co-chairing a European piece of work around risk communication during pandemics with WHO Euro. So, and I'm also leading some work where we're, with WHO Euro, looking at how we can engage with civil society organisations in a different way going forward. And I hope that will give some clues, not just for us, but actually other countries as well, as to how we can support individuals safely.
Thank you.
And can I ask, is UXA doing anything in relation to whether a CEV person should be allowed to wear a mask when attending healthcare appointments? Because we heard some evidence of shielders being told to take off masks, particularly if they were wearing perhaps FFP3 or FFP2, and it being replaced with a blue FRSN. Is your agency doing anything in that regard?
So,
is it your remit?
Obviously, I can't speak for whichever organisation has advised. I think I agree with comments which I think my colleagues have made, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, which is people should be supported to do what makes them feel safe. The only reason that may not be, you know, if it's going to harm somebody else, for example, somebody wearing a valved mask when they are infected, that's not a good idea for the rest of the group round them. But I think we're talking about precautions which make individuals feel comfortable, and if that's not interfering with their care or other safety, it feels the wrong thing. But clearly I can't speak for health services. That is, if it's an NHS organisation, it will be NHS England.
All right, thank you. One of the things you've already alluded to is clearly the longer term sort of psychological impact or mental health impact that the shielding programme had. And there was, can I have up on screen 348091? There was some guidance released by the government, including from Public Health. Can we just go to the first page, if at all possible, of it? If it's not, thank you. Guidance of public on the mental health and wellbeing aspects of coronavirus. Is this a general piece of advice, not specifically aimed at CV or CEV?
It is, and it recognises that there will be, you know, the whole population, I think, we've had increased rates of mental ill health. It wasn't for everybody, and I think this document, for some people who are in the clinically extremely vulnerable group, there may be some comments there which will help some people and would not be helpful to them, and we recognise that it's difficult to create documents which suit all different systems. On the advice that went out specifically to clinically extremely vulnerable, we tried to add on elements around mental health. And I remember actually when I personally was doing one of the early number 10 briefings, I actually flagged issues about mental health and specifically pulled out the risks, if you like, to CEV, who we recognised would be more isolated than others.
What about the risks to CV? Clearly a much larger cohort of people. Was there any specific advice given to the clinically vulnerable?
It was always, this is a different balance because individuals have different personal risk perceptions and judgments, and the advice can't be precise in an uncertain epidemiological future. So what we tried to do, and this actually I think is, these aren't specific to UKHSA or certainly not to OCMO, was give general advice and then build on it if there was individual communication with the different groups, as I've just explained for CEV.
Now, I think, thank you, that can come down. Can I just ask you this? Clearly, bearing in mind the impact that the shielding programme had on those that were shielding, do you think there should be any additional support and guidance given to certainly the immunocompromised people currently?
This is an important point, I think, for the future. I think there are two things. One is knowing what we know now about mental ill health and a pandemic of this size, actually putting in is difficult to prevent it, I think. There'll be some learning. But actually for a group like the CEV or CV, having a mechanism where their GP, for example, can see what a mental health status is as somebody progresses through. Some people will manage quite well. Some people enjoy being at home, having their garden. Other people who do not have those facilities have very poor health and perhaps were in the CEV group. Having a mechanism of monitoring that health, going through with a simple questionnaire, for example, on a regular basis of some sort, would, I think, be quite helpful, both to them or those who were supporting them at a distance, and particularly to health services to see where they could focus and target their support.
And in the event that there were to be a shielding programme in years, decades down the line, what sort of support or advice is ready-made, if you like, or available to be got up to speed to help them quickly understand what advice and guidance is out there for them?
I mean, guidance was put out, as you've seen. This was not something that was not thought of, and you are limited in what you can provide. I think one of the areas that we need to understand more, and is probably not covered effectively yet, is the digital divide, because if people have digital access and feel confident and comfortable to use it, they can reply to questionnaires, they can engage with people easily. If that is not the case, then the opportunity to support at a distance and safely from an infection risk perspective is much reduced, and I don't think we have got that covered yet.
Can I come to the end of the shielding programme, certainly as far as England is concerned? I think it ended on the 15th of September,
Yes.
2021. And clearly, I think you were asked, certainly back in April of 2020, whether there were any proposals to measure the effectiveness of the programme. And you deal with that, Professor, in your paragraph 46 onwards. So clearly it was in people's minds at the beginning of the programme to try and work out if the programme was working. And I'd like to ask you about an email chain, please, INQ 151754. And essentially you were asked, I think, to provide some comments on the efficacy or otherwise of the shielding programme. And I think we see on the first page, yes, it is, the first page at the bottom there is you replying to the request. And you say, you're only just back. You have some major concerns about looking at the efficacy. And you set out there, we have a whole data factory arisen from a single primary outcome measure of effectiveness, which is prevention of death. The only logical way I can see to identify relevant strong interim variables as proxy measures of success for this programme would be if the data being collected could demonstrably be linked back coherently to the model which SAGE or SPIM modelers used. And then you go on to say you can't see that's happened. Can you put that into layman's terms for us? What was your concern?
So if I explain the background to
Yes.
this, as a starting point, any public health intervention that goes in, you should always think about monitoring and evaluation. That goes as a standard, and you want to know if you've made a positive or hopefully not negative difference. So that's number one, and that will always be in the minds of any public health professional. Additionally, of course, there had been public resource invested in this programme as well, and we had colleagues from the NHS who wanted to understand things like health service utilisation. So everybody had an interest in understanding it. My prime interest was, did we actually prevent death? Did people do more good? But the Treasury, for example, would be interested in the funding and how much did it cost and what it had achieved. The difficulty we had here, this email came on the back. If you're senior as you are in the office of the Chief Medical Officer, you tend to see things quite late when many people have done a lot of work on things before you've seen them. And so people had been setting up, collecting large numbers of hospital data and coming up with a whole load of numbers and interpretations which were not valid. And so what we have is two things. Number one, we absolutely want to investigate and understand whether this has been effective. But number two, the proxy measures are what are the things that you can measure that will give a real, true picture of what has happened. And what I was presented with was a very, very long way from what I thought was effective for that purpose.
Let me ask you this then. Do you know, was there any work undertaken to ascertain whether the shielding programme did in fact prevent death?
Yes, there was a lot, and it was this was part of the start of it. So there was both a look at the, if you like, the health service data and mortality data and things like infection rates, where that was available. And then when this came through, you may have, I think I have put into the inquiry, I did do one very blunt email where I highlighted all of the reasons which I thought this was not an appropriate methodological evaluation. And so to check that this was just not me having a bad day, we involved the University of York, Professor Tim Doran and colleagues, to look at the ways, I flagged all of the reasons I thought this was not right, and we had not been able to work through a way to get a comparator group. Mm-hmm. And so we asked them to say, you know, what do you think of this early piece of work? I don't think it's acceptable. Have you got ideas as to how we could do this differently? And they came back with 4 different ways. Interrupted time series, synthetic control groups, regression discontinuity design, and various other things. All quite, but even those, they said, would struggle. They would be better than what we had, but they would not. And the fundamental problem is that if you have a belief that you are plausibly going to do good and protect people right at the start of this, you cannot have a comparator group because you will have left people out that you're trying to protect. And every time then that you try and make a comparator group, there is some major difference that does not allow you to make a true comparison. And so, in fact, effectively, the University of York agreed with us, and there is no definitive evaluation, but it's not for the want of trying.
All right. So can I take it, given that ultimate conclusion, the absence of a control group means it's almost impossible to be able to work out the efficacy of the programme, can I take it I don't need to ask you about the 4 different ways that they came up with and the interrupted time series, control groups, etc.?
Not in detail, but the one of those I perhaps would put back to relate to Professor Snook's evidence.
I was going to come on to that, yes. And can I start, and then if you haven't said what you wanted to add, please add it at the end, Professor, because I think you are aware that her conclusions were that given that there was a high rate of hospital-acquired infection, and given that the CEV group in particular are more likely to need healthcare and hospital appointments, she concluded that shielding did not consistently protect CEV people from infection, serious illness or death. And so she came to the conclusion that she would not support or recommend a shielding programme in the event of a future pandemic. Now, I think you're aware of her conclusions, and I'd like you, please, to put forward your views about her conclusions.
So I do feel very differently, as you can probably guess from my introduction. Firstly, I agreed actually with a lot of what Professor Snook said. She has also drawn the problems of comparator groups, and we've highlighted that. So that is a point of agreement. The difficulty then is she has then gone on to use evidence which almost is contradictory to the statement that she's made. So, and I would also perhaps separately like to pick up the point about the healthcare-associated infection. If I just go to the evidence, in fact, one of the types of methodology that was used by Felipe. It's the only one that, if I look across at all of the studies that she's included, actually picks up one of the recommendations from the University of York. That one actually said that the likely impact on reduction in mortality was 34%. So that's really positive. Now, I would not put forward a single study to show evidence in favour of shielding. I would lodge it and say we need more studies. But the only one that I think is methodologically near the main point is that one. If I then look and say, and I will use Professor Snook's own study, and I think you will be able to understand why this feels differently, the comparator group which she has used, even before you get to shielding characteristics, is starkly different. So for individuals, we always look in a study to say, what's the group we're interested in and what's the comparator? And they basically should be as close as possible to avoid confounding, apart from the thing you're looking at. And so you immediately, and she has set these out in her table 2 in her paper, but bearing in mind how important age is on its own as a risk factor, those who were 50 years old, equal to or 50 years old, form 79.6% of the shielding group, and in her comparator group, they form 39%. So we've already got almost a double difference, and we know how important age is. Then we look and say care home status, and the proportion of the group which she has included in the shielding group is twice as high as that in her comparator group. And I could go on. We then look at frailty, and 38.3% are in a frailty category of mild, moderate or severe in shielding. The point I make here, without getting into detail, is you have got a very, very different group of people before you start looking at shielding. And then, most of all, exactly as you have said, these individuals we expected to go into hospital frequently. We don't want them to be there. We want them to only go in when they need it and to do that safely and to stay out of the way when they didn't need to. She has no, as far as I can see, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I can see no clinical parameters at all which are compared in this. So we've got a younger, healthier, unspecified population. We would expect the shielding group to be going in and out of hospital, sadly, probably with much, much higher mortality rates and being tested much more frequently.
So if this is too simplistic, please say, but in short, you're saying she didn't compare like with like?
Yes, and I don't think she can, and she's used several studies to look, and I admire that. That's exactly what we should do. But I think, whereas she has published that, I have gone to University of York and said, please check that I'm actually seeing this the right way. The only way I think we could do it in the future, and this is an important point, is to say, who do we think are in these cohorts of individuals? They're very different illnesses, might be the same people we would want to contact again. Let's say we have avian flu or something popping up, and actually take groups so that we know broadly what their average healthcare utilisation is now. It would still be very difficult, but at least we would have better understanding, and that could come, for example, from what you might call peacetime digital cohorting, actually looking at those groups in the intervening period.
Do I take it from what you've said then that in the event of a future pandemic, would you recommend a shielding programme or not?
Well, I would. There's the what, whether, what and how. So whether, the answer is yes, I would. I would find it very difficult as a clinician to say, I know there are people who, for plausible clinical reasons, are likely to be at heightened risk from an infection which has no vaccine, no countermeasures, no therapeutics, and just say, sorry, I'm not going to give any particular advice or support. That feels wrong. Would I do it differently? We've discussed lots of communication elements, yes. Would I try and set things up sooner? Yes. Would we have the Q-COVID, for example, was a tool actually to support individual risk assessment as well. And the sooner that's set up, it still needs time to collect data before you can use it. But the sooner that's set up, then obviously, again, we have more information. But yes, I would, actually. And I'm afraid, with respect and for all the reasons I've said, I feel strongly I would find it very difficult just to say, I'm doing nothing.
Can you help with whether you're aware of any research now being done on the efficacy of the shielding programme?
Well, for the reasons that we've said, I think we have stopped for this time because, of course, individuals are vaccinated. Even as the programme was running, time was changing and the parameters, different variants, they're quite variable. So it is quite difficult to do.
And finally on this, I think you said you wanted to say something about the healthcare-acquired infections.
Yes.
And I'd just like you to hear your views on that.
Yeah, so Number one, we definitely want to minimise healthcare acquired infections. To some extent, it's predictable they would be there. I think that's actually even in some of the records, SAGE and NervTag. But the way it's been linked with shielding seems a complete anomaly to me. So my position would be, we want to protect people who are clinically extremely vulnerable maximally, regardless of what is happening in the healthcare system. So if rates are high, we want to reduce them for them and for everybody, but they are not, it's a non sequitur, they are not necessarily linked. We still want to protect people, and those people were mostly not in hospital. They would visit frequently, many of them, but they're mostly at home, and we will protect them as much of the time that we possibly can.
Can I leave shielding there and turn to some other matters, and perhaps your second statement from June 2024, which is perhaps more within the UXA remit than the DCMO remit, although clear if there's crossover, please say. Can I just ask you, you have set out helpfully a number of locations of experts in the UK at your paragraph 3.5, little 3. I think you mentioned there are UXA experts in Cardiff and Glasgow. Can I ask, are there any UXA experts situated in Belfast?
No, there aren't, but we
Why not?
do. Well, it's not designed on a geographical basis. It's designed around where support is needed. And so we have a team. Some of these are contracted services, if you like. Public health services are devolved, most of them. But the UK Health Security Agency is the lead for global health security with government and for some specific specialty areas, so things around radiation, and we have chemical expertise. The devolved administrations generally are too small to maintain services, and so those cases are some of our specialist services. But Northern Ireland actually calls on us as well, and we have very close links. I do personally, both with the chief executives of each of the agencies and also with each of the CMOs and their team.
The inquiry's heard a lot about transmission and terminology in relation to COVID, but can I ask you, as at today in November 2024, does UXA now accept that COVID is transmitted via the airborne route, potentially as well as other routes?
Yes, and I think that's clear in our documentation.
And in the event of a new coronavirus, what assumptions, if any, are going to be made as to how the virus is transmitted?
Well, clearly we need to learn from the evidence as it accrues, and the reason I think that there has been, as many people have said, that movement from a predominantly, not exclusive, but predominantly fomite and droplet-based depression was based on historic evidence of near relatives, if you like, in virological terms. But actually we now have a whole lot more information on this one, so we're starting with a different evidence base. And I think the two areas which I know Milady will know from Module 2 before, I call it a sensitivity analysis, that when you're starting off looking, we need to broaden the area that we are thinking about in detail and in planning. And so things like asymptomatic transmission, and the relevant, the relative proportion of transmission by different routes needs to be thought through, I think, with more clarity at the start. I think all of this, it was a reasonable assumption to start with what we knew, but clearly the evidence has grown and changed as we've gone forward.
So if there were a new coronavirus, would the assumption be that it is droplet fomite and airborne?
Well, it would be very bad practice to assume anything, actually. It would be a good starting place because that is exactly what we have seen and grown now, and then we would need to continue to explore that. And I think the importance of testing, we did not have testing capacity at the start of the pandemic to investigate some of this in more detail. And so work which is probably not visible to this module that UKHSA is doing on establishing rapid stand-up of testing, and also the opportunity to do point-of-care testing as early as possible, so lateral flow tests for new pathogens, is really important work for actually understanding the virus much earlier.
Just going back to your point about on transmission, it was a reasonable place to start. But didn't we already know by the time the pandemic hit us that SARS was a virus from the original SARS, what did you call it, SARS?
CoV-1, effectively, yeah.
That was airborne. Didn't we already know that?
I mean, I'm not a virology expert in that area, but I don't think. I mean, we have different viruses. They don't cause this element of severity that we've had during this time, and I don't think anybody ruled out. In fact, I haven't heard anybody, and I'm not saying either, that airborne transmission was ruled out. It's the proportion which is the tricky part. And I think what we've absolutely seen is the proportion, both of that and of asymptomatic transmission as well, has turned out to be much more significant than was, I think, put in the sort of frame at the start of the pandemic.
But I've heard from, as you may have gathered, from quite a few IPC specialists, and they seem to become rather wedded to the idea that it wasn't airborne. And so I'm just really, I suppose, using you as an expert in other areas. Should they not have been thinking about the possibility it was airborne from a very...
So I think the evidence, I might struggle to point you directly to individual papers, but a lot of the evidence that we have, including at SAGE, for example, says that it talks about airborne transmission. What it doesn't do is talk about it as a major or high proportion of the transmission risk, and I think that's the element which you learn as you go forward. And to be honest, even now, I'm not sure we do have a really strong estimate of what it is. I think everybody accepts it's there, and it's significantly higher than was accounted for at the start.
Only to correct one thing, I think the World Health Organisation tweeted it wasn't airborne at the beginning.
I agree.
But we'll put that as an anomaly.
I think CMO made a point about that
Yeah.
it probably. I think most people recognise that there is a spectrum of transmission normally, and it tends to be at one end or another, and you can have multiple routes of transmission. It tends to be one or another, or a bit of these two. And it's as you get used to the pathogen and more research is done, it becomes much more evident then which are the critical transmission routes.
Is AXA doing any work to ascertain the amount, my words, of virus that is contained in droplets as opposed to transmitted via aerosols?
So I wouldn't be able to give you a list of all of the research that we're doing, along with many other organisations. We have funded research from NIHR, and we work with other organisations. We definitely have research, which I know you're aware of, in relation to respiratory protective equipment. And we do routinely do work on IPC. And so, I mean, one of the really important studies, I think, from this pandemic has been the Siren study, which I mentioned. That was an urgent public health study, and that is continuing, including work on IPC.
May I just ask you about one matter that Professor Hopkins told us about? We had an exchange about the terminology used and whether it was helpful or otherwise to maintain the airborne droplet terminology or move to far field, near field, and perhaps other terminology in between. And she told us that there was some work ongoing. But I wanted to try and get a sense from you. Is there any timescale for when this terminology review is going to be completed and then translated in due course, perhaps to new NIPCM guidance?
I think I would have to refer you back to Professor Hopkins for that, I'm afraid. I don't have the detail.
Well, she just said there was a number of forums that were engaged in looking at the terminology. I think where we got to was, well, that's all well and good to look at it, but when's the product going to come? Perhaps if you could ask her, that would be extremely helpful. May I turn then perhaps to some IPC and PPE matters? And I think you say in your statement that it was not your role during the pandemic to author guidance, but you would be shown guidance and would sense check it, as well as to contribute your understanding based on your knowledge at the time. What were you sense checking for, Professor?
So in the OCMO role, DCMO role, and particularly when the triple lock was put on, I would be sense guidance on almost anything, mostly at 1 o'clock in the morning for a 1 hour turnaround. And so a lot of what I was doing was just trying to check that somebody had thought through what the implications were in another part of the system. If I give an example, IPC guidance in healthcare systems, was there an implication for education or work front? But obviously I would also try and professionally keep up with developments and literally act as a spot checker. People were working at high pace and to see if there were anomalies. Might be IPC, it might be testing, so it was much more of a checking arrangement between systems than necessarily the detail of the content. But if I saw things, then I would flag them and pull them out.
I think that was in your role as DCMO. I'd like to ask you though about a roundtable that you chaired in January 2022 when you would have been CEO of UXA by that stage. And it's at your paragraph 6.26, if it helps you, Professor. But I think once Omicron had emerged in January 2022, you chaired a roundtable discussion on RPE and in particular FFP3 masks, attended by representatives from DHSE, the Four Nations IPC cell, NHS England, the Health and Safety Executive, and indeed the public health agencies. And could we have up on screen, please, INQ 348432. This is a summary of the discussion. It was a couple of hours, the meeting. And I think you say in your statement, the purpose of the meeting was to ensure a shared understanding of the current guidance. Sense checks the guidance to ensure that it was clear. I had no personal authority to change the guidance. That rested with the IPC cell. But was there a concern that there were aspects of the IPC guidance that was not clear?
So as I've noted before, I would often be asked to chair meetings where we had quite a spread of colleagues either across the health system or health and care or local authorities having worked in those areas. And so this was probably one of those meetings. I would be able to understand different insights from where people were reflecting their own practice. There was quite a lot of noise about this time. So this was the Omicron time. I seem to remember the meeting was organised just before Christmas, and so people were concerned, as it says here, about whether the Omicron, it was a new variant, and people were concerned about whether it was going to be more transmissible. And as I think you've discussed, there was still quite a lot of conversation, shall we say, about FFP3s, fluid-resistant masks. And the purpose for me in this, and this is probably from experience, is actually to make sure we all know what the argument is about, if there is one, and be clear what we can then need to do to resolve it. And so having a meeting like this was to enable all of those contributing to feel that they had a space to explore that and see where the differences lay, if there were any, and what we all needed to do about it.
Can we scroll down, please, to the summary section and section beginning guidance? All the attendees, a number of whom we are familiar with now, Professor, indeed have heard from, jointly noted that the UK IPC guidance already enables the use of FFP3 in appropriate risk settings. However, there was some agreement that further messaging may enable appropriate wider use where needed. And it's that I'd like to ask you about. What was the concern, given that UK IPC guidance said FFP3 can be used, I think if you're risk assessed and needed it, or you're working in an AGP area or a hotspot, why was there still concern in January 2022 that there needed to be further messaging to enable wider use of FFP3?
So I think some of this is actually about, the conversations about the evidence base, but some of it goes back to the insight which I reflected from the work that Kevin Fenton did, actually, which is not all staff felt able to come forward and ask. So I think many colleagues, and I would agree with this, there is a standard that has to be met for face coverings, and we've seen that from HSE and from the IPC guidance. But on an individual basis, people could use FFP3s on a local risk assessment. And I think what came through the meeting was that was not happening for some reason, whether it's because messaging from individual trusts wasn't landing correctly, whether people were not coming forward and asking to do that. I wasn't sure, but that's why we've got the word enable there. The guidance itself wasn't changed,
No.
but what we hoped it would do would support individuals who felt it was appropriate through their risk assessments and individual requirements to get to use FFP3s. And there was no shortage or anything at this time. This was purely to support individuals to ask questions and to use kit they felt was appropriate.
May I ask you, Professor, one understands the tenor of this was to try and increase usage if people wanted it, felt able to ask for it. But how is this practically, having this discussion at the round table, actually going to translate to those on the ground that either want to ask for it or have to risk assess and provide it?
So there's a human element to all of this, and I say this is often where I end up in many of these meetings. You will see me at random meetings on different topics, because sometimes it just needs a connection between organisations to allow people to understand what the shared picture is and then feel able to go out and take that message. Now, in this case, most of this utilisation will have been in the NHS, and NHS were present. So from the perspective of anyone who was sitting there, everybody who was around the table knew what we'd all agreed, and then everybody would and should be supportive and giving out a single message in any environment to say this is what is available and appropriate. That hadn't necessarily, I think, for all the reasons you've heard, been as clear up to that point. The end result, I mean, at the end of the day, it is the employer's responsibility, and the employer for most frontline staff was actually the NHS.
Yeah, and it may be that we'll ask this question of those witnesses that are coming
Yes.
as well. It's just the mind may be willing, but it's the translation on the ground that I'm struggling to see how this round table actively helps the hospital or the employer enable more use of FFP3 if it's wanted.
So that is a translational question for the NHS. That happens with many areas, but nevertheless, it often is of value, I think, to have senior representatives from organisations to sit round, agree what they're all agreeing, and make sure, therefore, that anybody in the system knows this is what all of their seniors are signed up to. It takes away some of the sometimes erroneous dispute as a starting point.
Now, underpinning a lot of the conversation or concern back in the day was whether FFP3 is more protective or otherwise than FRSM. And I'd like to piggyback on some evidence that Professor Hopkins gave, because she told us that certainly in a healthcare setting, there was no evidence that it was more protective. We looked at observational studies that suggested it was. Indeed, there are lab studies that suggest it was. But I'd like your help, please, with what UXA was doing back in January 2022 in trying to design trials that might determine whether FFP3 was more effective than FRSM. And if it helps you, I think on the 4th of January, is it right that UXA applied for funding for a randomised control trial called WHIPIT?
Yes.
Can you help us with what WHIPIT was,
So
please?
WHIPIT was a winter infection protection study to try and look at the use of face coverings, FFP3s and fluid-resistant surgical masks, and indeed some funding was provided for that, initial funding, which was utilised. It was rejected, I think, at a second stage, and I'm very happy to send you the detail, because I think some of these funding applications will go in an initial phase and then it will go to a second phase, often rejected or challenged on methodology. So certainly UKHSA was doing work then, it's an NIHR grant, to try and establish different mechanisms for exploring this work. And then there was another study, a SURE study, application, which to look at sessional use through a randomised control trial.
Pausing there with the, we'll come to sessional use in a moment.
Sorry, before you go any further, 4th of January, which year?
2022.
22.
Thank you.
My fault, I'm so sorry.
We didn't exist until October 21. So.
the trial was designed to try and work out which, if either of the masks, provided the best protection. And you've explained, I think, there that it perhaps didn't go ahead. It begs the question, what is being done now to determine what is undoubtedly a really important question for a number of healthcare workers who wanted FFP3, felt they were more protected by FFP3, even if in fact it may turn out in a study to be less protective or not as protective as they hoped?
I might make a comment on the evidence base in a moment, but in terms of this, so I think there were two studies, the Whippet one and then Shaw, which was a similar one about sessional use, so clearly actively exploring these. But I think UKHSA absolutely recognises that this is an area that we need to get much more certainty. So we have put in a small amount of Pump Prime. We're not a funding organisation, but we've put in a small amount of funding internally ourselves to develop an observational framework so that we can move to assess mask use in healthcare workers. We're doing some work within the Siren study, which is possible. And then I think overall we've got studies focused on experience of users, how to assess that, so the framework, and then policy around it. But and I think we will be trying to obviously move towards other studies as well. I can send you the detail of that. I mean, these are quite technically difficult ones, so they will often be rejected or challenged quite appropriately on methodology to get that right, so we get an outcome result. And I think it's not just UKHSA either. There will be a number of academic institutes around the country also who are doing similar work.
The observational framework that you just spoke about, what are the kind of timescales we're looking at, though,
I would have to come back because these are quite detailed research plans. So very happy to send that back to the inquiry seat.
And you mentioned the Shaw study, which was in April 2022.
Yep.
UCSA applied for funding for the sessional use of respiratory protective equipment, Shaw trial for short, to develop the evidence base around different strategies. What was the aim of the study?
Well, because we'd introduced and recommended sessional use, and again, I think that there was a lot of validity in that, but often healthcare workers also felt that was probably, they didn't feel comfortable. So again, it's one of these areas we just need to work out and get a really strong evidence base behind. That application, I think, was rejected. Again, for methodological reasons, it needed a particular cluster randomised trial study. So I think the best thing I can do is probably send you the detail of the active work that's ongoing, and we can look as well at if we're aware of other research institutes.
Can you just help me to this extent? Was the purpose of the Shaw trial to work out whether sessional use is in fact safe?
Well, we would not have introduced it as an approach if we didn't think it was safe during the pandemic. I mean, that goes without saying, but I think it's more how effective are things and what is more effective than anything else. And these are all questions which you're very familiar with from all of the inquiry participants.
But these are questions that don't just affect us in the UK, they affect people around the world.
Yes.
So
totally.
presumably other countries are doing research? Or?
They do. And many of our, many people in UKHSA have counterparts, if you like, working on different things overseas. And often there will be trials. We've got an online research database, might be, looking at MPOX, or it might be looking at something like this. We have a lab, and we have a set of a hospital ward in our science hub in Porton Down, where we can actually test out some of these things, and some of that research has been assessed here. But it needs funding and it needs a plan with it. So I think probably the best thing is if I can set out for you what we actually have in train at the moment in some of the studies that have taken place.
Can I ask you about testing of hospital inpatients and indeed testing of frontline staff? And I'm aware that there is another module looking at testing, but Her Ladyship has heard a number of witnesses and experts urge strongly that in the event of a future pandemic, the need to get testing up and running as soon as possible is absolutely key. For example, to keeping patients safe, working out if patients have the disease, dealing with asymptomatic people, dealing with healthcare-acquired infections across the board. Can you just summarise, if you're able to, what is UXA's ability now to roll out testing more quickly than perhaps had happened at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020?
So again, I'll just be boring on the responsibilities. So there were different pillars of testing, which we'll come on to. That obviously a lot of people are referring to the mass community testing. But in terms of what happens if we have a new pathogen, so in fact, the reason we got this test running pretty quickly, very quickly, was because there had been preceding work internationally over the prior 5 or 10 years to actually look at a bank of coronavirus tests so that they could be tweaked effectively when this pathogen arrived. So, in fact, the actual initial test was done very, very quickly by PHE and then could be ramped up to a small number of specialist laboratories. Yeah. The difficulty is in the stretch out from there. So we are doing work on priority pathogens. So what do we think is the most likely next critical pathogen to come along? There's international work as well. We're linked into that. And then looking at how rapidly we can roll out. And there does need to be, there's a safety issue around HID about when different labs can handle different pathogens, which we need to be aware of. But on the assumption they can roll out, it's then UKHSA's opportunity to roll out to NHS labs, and then they can continue that testing for inpatients. So there is national work on testing capacity, and it is much clearer than it was. It won't go. I mean, obviously there are political decisions about how far one prepares for pathogens for the future. But I think that is in a very different place to where it was. It is still the NHS responsibility and was then to be testing their staff.
We've heard also about a desire for more testing to enable more visitors to be able to attend either end-of-life visitor, maternity services, and perhaps many other different settings in between. And I think everyone understands that there will be priorities, but what about the availability or ability to roll out the testing so that it's more widespreadly available to enable more visiting?
So 2 points. If we're just talking testing, and that's not my main comment actually, but I know that's the focus of your answer. The real game changer was around getting lateral flow devices, and so UKHSA is doing work currently at Porton Down. We still monitor and check that the current LFDs will work against new variants. That goes on all the time, but we're also doing work under a diagnostics accelerator to try and ensure that effectively we can get LFDs up and running as quickly as possible for new pathogens. Now, none of that is assured, but there is a very new focus on doing that. The wider point I want to make, which you may not welcome, but I'm going to make it, is around hierarchies of control, because a test is a tiny, tiny part of the IPC control. And in fact, if you have visitors, you're saying you have a test, an LFD, they're brilliant at saying, are you infectious at this minute? Really good. They won't necessarily be telling you you're infectious the next day, so there's an issue about how often you do them. But equally, if visitors, there's a learning where we need to learn together, I think, particularly for regular visitors, where there is always a risk of bringing in infection from a community, and hospitals or care homes have a duty to protect all of their patients and all of their staff, not just the individual patient. And so this balance is important. And I think the more shared understanding there is of that hierarchy of control, just about how you move around a building, about ventilation, which we haven't mentioned much, is really important, just as important actually as that test.
Can I turn to some comments you make in your second statement, starting at page 34, please, Professor? And we touched on some of the work you were doing in relation to occupational risk, and then there's a section beginning ethnicity. And I think you commented on a number of pieces of guidance, not all of which was healthcare guidance, some of which was social care guidance. But I just want to understand really what your concerns were that you were setting out at paragraph 7.2 onwards relating to risk reduction frameworks and the undoubted risk there is to people from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic community, as Professor Fenton's inequalities report brought to the fore?
I'm afraid I don't have the page in front of me, but I think yes, I know what you're referring to. So my concern is about long-term support and reduction in harm, and the risk of running to conclusions on very early data without really understanding what's sitting behind them. My anxiety was we would be doing, if you like, tick box exercises, I'm summarising for brevity, without really understanding what was sitting behind the data. So, in fact, and I think Professor Whitty said this, if you look at those who were impacted most, particularly in numbers, on the first wave and the second wave, you immediately see that we have those of Black African heritage, Caribbean African heritage on the first wave, and it was in London, and we know that somewhere near 45% of our health service staff who are supporting running public services are from those heritage. And then if we move then to the next wave, that's not the ethnic group that's affected, it's Southeast Asian. So it's very clear that that is not a biological ethnicity issue. There are some small variations. It is actually a representational issue. And so my anxiety, and I was possibly a little bit outspoken in some of these areas, was that by only looking at that immediate knee-jerk reaction and doing what are quite superficial in some ways, risk assessments, we would miss the point that we do not have appropriate representation through all of our ranks, through our senior NHS. And I think in some of these conversations, I was very anxious. So we had, for example, pregnant women were just being told not to go into work, not being allowed to go into work, or senior individuals potentially being taken off the front line, just at the point when we're starting to reasonably, still not right, get appropriate representation of ethnicity through our health services and our public services to truly represent the communities that we serve. And so it's an area where, again, I've been in the public system for a long time. We have not seen much movement, and I was concerned this would actually be a retrograde step if we weren't honest about what was sitting underneath it.
Can I ask you about an email that might bring to the fore some of those problems? And INQ 152140, please, which should be an email involving you, yes, thank you, in June of 2020. And at the bottom of the page, you'd been asked by the Government Equalities Office for support with some questions summarised below. And then it says the question regarding what you're looking for with regards to guidances that are sent your way. I expect we can go back and state that ensuring appropriate stakeholders have been engaged and the right channels are followed. But essentially, you were being asked some questions about signing off new guidance, which also involved guidance going to the BAME communities. And that then resulted in your response on the first page of saying it's quite tricky. You might benefit from a pragmatic, unminuted conversation with GEO to get a shared understanding of what is and what is not possible. And then there's key things that they should be aware of. There are a number of different tools being developed which will incorporate ethnicity risk. There is potential for these to be picked up differentially. What did you mean by that?
So this goes back to Q-COVID. So one of the things about Q-COVID was that it effectively pulls in a whole load of data. And not only did it inform the clinically extremely vulnerable group and support appropriate individuals being pushed upwards into a higher vaccination group and safety, it also was designed to allow an individual to have a conversation with their GP about their own individual risks. But what we had at the time was a multiplicity of everybody developing some sort of tool to put in occupational settings. There was actually a review, which I think I've quoted in my statement, which looked at about a dozen of these different tools which were being advocated, including one which was being advocated in the NHS, I think. And the only one that was suggested as suitable for community settings. Four of them were for hospital settings. The only one that was supported was actually Q-COVID, which as the time was not completed, it suggested it needed to go out for peer review and validation, which it did, and it passed with flying colours. It was assessed by ONS and other external bodies. None of the others did. Now, when it comes back to this particular issue, again, my concern was different people will be going in getting different, unvalidated answers, having wrong risk perception, and then, again, coming away either worried from their work, making decisions about their work which disadvantage them and their families in the long term. And there was no control on this, which was why everybody agreed to use the Q-COVID tool.
Right. So a proliferation of tools at the beginning was unhelpful for the reasons you've just set out. You say there is a very poor understanding of the comparative or combined risk in most discussions you've had. Whose was the poor understanding?
Just generally around the systems. Again, and I'm not trying to pick on the NHS here. What they were trying to do was answer the concerns, quite reasonable fear, I think, and concerns of their workforce. The difficulty is, though, and I tend to use, say, two examples. If you were a young black 24-year-old footballer in London, your risk was probably still very, very low. But if you were white with immunocompromised or whatever, the risk would be very different. And what you needed was a tool. Now, overall, there are a number of underlying health conditions which are much more prevalent in people from different ethnic minorities. And the whole point here is it needs a proper risk assessment with all the right parameters going in, not just a suddenly you are this or you are that and you are boxed. And again, I say my concern was that we would end up with illogical responses which actually disadvantage people in the long run.
The Q-COVID tool, though, identified people who were at higher risk of infection and or mortality, as I understand
Yes.
it. So I understand it being helpful on saying, yes, you're more at risk, but it doesn't necessarily help you work out how to then risk assess and put in practical implications, sorry, practical measures to stop you getting infected.
Well, when it was up and running, it did. And in fact, what we tried to do, this is probably a recommendation about occupational health, because there is no single national occupational health system. But had there been, we could have rolled out the Q-COVID so that with your occupational health clinician, you had a conversation where you put in your own risk factors, and effectively it will give a relative risk or an absolute risk of severe outcomes or mortality from COVID. And it would combine those risk factors so people had a proportionate understanding of their risk and then took proportionate action. And many people were very frightened at this stage. So it was, in some ways, some of the risk tools, I think, were actually, some of the language, the narrative, was making, I think, concerns worse in many places.
You say some interventions which are really practical and would help will not land well in the current context of inequalities. What were you talking about?
Well, these are the wider societal ones.
Okay.
I mean, it's probably why I said at the start, often when you're asked to respond, and I'm being very open and honest here, people want, there is a problem, people want to see an answer. But actually, the same problems follow infectious disease round, which you will have heard through this. And we need to understand those. I mean, if there are, for example, I think most of the differential outcomes actually in current data is gone once you take away things like vaccination, underlying health conditions. But the obvious thing here, just as an example, would be why are we not paying the same attention to cardiac events in South Asian males, for example, routinely and looking at the data? We shouldn't just be trying to put in another layer of PPE now.
And finally, in relation to this email, please, you say, I'm very fearful we will get reverse inequality long term if we're not very careful how this is managed. For example, lack of BAME opportunity in senior positions, for example, BAME banished from frontline roles and therefore career development in NHS England, where the trend in equality has only just started to be turned. I'm asked to ask you if you could clarify what you meant by the phrase reverse inequality and what specific concerns were worrying you.
I mean, this is just an example, but we know that we don't have equitable representation of our communities at different levels through our services. So even if I look at UK Health Security Agency, where I am passionate about trying to get diversity and equality, I haven't managed it in my top team. We are overrepresented in some of our lower grades, but we still don't have it right, despite proactive trying in our more senior posts, and that is absolutely classic across the system. And any intervention like this, where you suddenly start effectively, although done with the right intentions, targeting people and moving them out of post, their careers will go backwards as well. They don't have the experience for 2 or 3 years during a pandemic, and then we're back to square one. So it was really to be possibly running a bit against the tide, but to flag some of the risks of doing this when we didn't have good indications of what the true risks to individuals were.
And finally on this topic, appreciating that you are not responsible for employer practices, as we do, are you able to help, though, with what, if any, further action can be taken in healthcare settings to protect ethnic minority healthcare workers from higher risk of infection and, dare I say, at higher risk of mortality?
So many, going back to these points here, many of in fact, the vast majority, if you look at data now, I mean, I may not be up with all of the latest detail of it, so please do refer to other colleagues, so people like Camlish Cunty, who I know has contributed, and I worked with Kevin Fenton at the time. Many of those differences can be taken out of the data. They are not directly related to the infection. The infection is following round systems of inequality. So high occupation houses, particularly roles where people are public facing frequently. So we've had the conversation about healthcare workers, but actually those healthcare workers were also the ones who are mostly going out on transport during the pandemic. They're the ones most exposed. So we will always have inequalities until we have equal representation across all of our public services.
May I move finally, please, to some lessons learned and recommendations, and a number of perhaps slightly discrete topics, but nonetheless ones we hope that UCSA will be able to help us with. We have heard, Professor, about the makeup of the UK IPC cell, and there is potentially a recommendation to be made around about expanding the makeup and membership of that cell, including potentially some specialisms that may be represented on the IPC cell. And I want to know, are you in a position to help us as to what other specialisms might be useful on such a cell?
I've realised my facial expression may be giving my view on this. We need to be very careful, I think, about having groups that are functional in size. The more people you get around, the more difficult it is to get somewhere. The real question is what is the skill set that is missing and where should it be? And I think I agree with Professor Hopkins' comments. I think she pushed back quite hard on, do we have these skills in the system already? Every hospital trust has a Director for Infection Prevention Control. They will work with their engineers. There's some really, really skilled people around the system. So the question is that thinking represented in the IPC? The other thing I would just flag is, as you would have seen, there are sometimes differences, anti-groupthink between UKHSA science positions and a practical position. That is an important distinction, and neither is incorrect. And I think the question might be, where do you want that science to feed in? Because we do have environmental scientists feeding into UKHSA advice. We have research running down at Porton Down, for example. The question is, and I'm not suggesting it should all be in UKHSA either. I thought the environmental group in Sage was fabulous. So my own view is the IPC cell, or that is is a practical translation of advice into the health system, and trying to intersperse different skills there is quite challenging. It's also important that the advice can be utilised at a local level with the skills that are there.
Taking your point about the expertise that exists around the country. If I got an impression, it was that the guidance that came from the UK IPC cell was treated as the word of God and followed by everybody as if this was the most highly specialised specialists in the country. And so I suppose that's why I would question. So your very expert director of IPC in a hospital will just... I haven't yet decided, but that's one of the things that's worrying me, that it was taken as if this was written in stone and everyone had to follow it, even if people didn't really agree with it.
This may be a better question for NHS colleagues, because that's where it goes out. I mean, my experience, if I go round the other side of being a Director of Public Health, say, in Norwich, and working directly with the Acute Trust and with the Health Protection Agency then, my experience is DIPSIs are hugely experienced individuals. They know their environments really well. And so the trick is to get the guidance that comes out to give the framework and as much detail as is needed, but then allow that to be translated in a local setting. And that is really important because, as I think Dr. Shin has said, many others, the NHS estate is so different that just taking something and applying it systematically, absolutely everywhere, is really difficult to do and not necessarily helpful.
Thank you.
You mentioned that you mentioned the work of the environmental modelling group that was a subgroup, I think, of SAGE. We understand that that's been stood down now that we're not in the emergency phase of the pandemic. But do I understand from what you just said that there are nonetheless environmental scientists still working on behalf of UXA to do the same kind of work that the EMG did?
So we have scientists working, for example, as I say, in Porton Down, but equally, Kath Noakes, who was the chair of that group, again, I'd have to come back with the detail, I won't have it to hand, but many of these connections or research work, she will be working almost certainly on pieces of research, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of my staff are as well, but I'd have to try and find you that. Some of that will move then into academic research environments, though, so it won't necessarily sit within UKHSA, and many of them will have or will be applying for NIHR funding as well.
Slightly different topic. Is UKHSA involved in any work being undertaken as to whether the AGP list, the aerosol generating procedure list, should remain as a list, and if so, what procedures should be on it?
So clearly that didn't end in, I think we can see that there is the position it's got to is a practical one in the sense of there was a scientific position and another one. I think this is one of the areas, along with the FFP3s and AGPs, is one that we need to resolve. But that is actually an international debate as well. It is not simply a UK debate.
But is UXA involved in
again, I think the best thing I can do with all of the detailed research is this is not an area that I will personally be directly involved with each day. So let me come back and identify against the key topics where there are research programmes running that we're aware of and involved.
All right. My lady, I've got about 5 minutes left. I wonder if I might finish and then we take
yes,
our break, if that's convenient.
Yes.
Right. Can I ask you about this? We've heard about the proliferation of guidance that was issued invariably late on a Friday, some of which had PHE's name attached to it, and that having to be trickled down and then implemented in the hospitals and the like. And I just, there may be an urge for a more streamlined process, and if there can be more streamlining, what would it look like?
Well, I think just to go back to that, I mean, clearly I wasn't directly involved with that, but PHE published, it was not the author, it was definitely not the disseminator. And I think that's important because the issue I think you're raising is how does this land, if you like, effectively and sensibly with frontline workers. The NIPCM is now on the NHSE site. We have done a piece of work to ensure that the roles and responsibilities are clearly set out. Just to, I always thought they were clear before, but clearly that's not how has been portrayed through this inquiry. So I think we've done that piece of work, and that has been agreed with Department for Health and with NHS England. And so the short answer to your question is that should be the NHS, always has been, but we'll be clear it's disseminating. In terms of the Friday night thing, and I think Sir Chris Whitty gave a similar answer. I mean, I have been guilty of sending things out on a Friday night on occasion, but we always think really carefully. So if it was, for example, an infectious disease outbreak, you know, are we putting out a press notice at 6 o'clock at night to frighten everybody over the weekend? Do we need to? Sometimes we do, because we need to alert the public or workers in a hospital. You can imagine a Novichok incident, for example. But generally, we know that putting things out, we have Friday as a no publication day unless we absolutely need to. And in fact, you'll see all of UKHSA standard data, whether, you know, TB, infectious disease, what have you, that our standard publication day is Thursday, exactly for that reason.
Different topic again, please. Hibernated studies. Module 3 has heard from Professors Breitling and Evans in relation to long COVID and hibernated studies that were woken up, for want of a better phrase, in the pandemic. Is UXA involved in ensuring that there may be hibernated studies that are capable of being brought to life in the event of a future pandemic?
So just so that I make sure I'm on the same line, I think these are NIHR hibernated studies, which effectively, when there's an incident, we step up. So the ones that we would be involved with would be around things like early infection risk, understanding the pathogen. There is now a new framework, actually, which includes cross-government framework, which Lucy Chappell, the Chief Scientific Advisor in the Department of Health, has worked on. We've been part of those conversations. It runs with some of the testing as well. So we're definitely involved with some of those. The more clinical side of things, I think you raised that on probably on a long COVID basis, we wouldn't be involved with.
Communications generally and the balance of the message that is put out, is that something that you have already touched on, Professor? But can I ask you, what are the risks of being more transparent with the public in future, that maybe hospitals are overwhelmed or nosocomial infection rates are on the rise? How could that potentially fear engendering communication be mitigated to encourage people to still come into hospital or seek treatment?
Most good public health interventions are based on a background of trust, whether that be around infection control, whether it be about vaccination. And certainly for UKHSA, we have the opportunity, quite unusually, of being a relatively new organisation. And so I have set out to say we will always be transparent with what we do. And you will have seen, I think, in some of the work Dr. Shin and colleagues report about some of our appraisals, for example, they are up on the website and very clear. We go out early with technological briefings, for example, about variants. So I think there's what do we do routinely that generates background trust. And then on some of the data, there is a point, I think, which is a wider issue about the public being used to what might happen during a pandemic, what normal looks like, rather than everybody suddenly focusing in when there's a calamity. Now, that's easier said than done. I don't hold the NHS data. We do model for the NHS in these sorts of incidents. But I think, again, that's probably one, for those instances, better reflected back to NHS colleagues.
Is UXA involved in any way in monitoring the deaths of healthcare workers in the event of a future pandemic?
And only in the sense of we will be party to things like you will have heard of the COSIN. So we use data that comes through in order for us to understand early viral characteristics. And things like the early data will try and indicate any clinical risks or any occupational risks. And certainly during the pandemic, exactly as Sir Chris Whitty said, I would see data coming through, recognising, as some have pointed out, I think, that it is not complete. And sometimes we don't distinguish, we'd have healthcare workers and what about, I saw different data on a social care side, for example. So there is, I think, a wider discussion to have, again, looking forward, around death certification, because it doesn't currently have ethnicity for a number of very good reasons. But actually, the more we understand about occupation, about ethnicity, and about other characteristics, and that could almost certainly be within a data link system, the more quickly we'll be able to understand where true risks are and then be able to take action.
Finally, this from me, please. If there were one recommendation you would urge Her Ladyship to consider on UXA's behalf to make the response of the healthcare system better next time, what would it be?
Data. I'm afraid it's a recurrent theme, and it's a huge theme, but much of our work is around interpreting data. It needs to be robust. The more variables we have, the more information we can provide. The sooner we have it, the earlier we can give advice and take action and protect lives.
My lady, those are all my questions.
Thank you very much. I shall return at 20 past, and a warning to all call participants, do not expect any generosity from me this afternoon. Mr. Wagner. Mr. Wagner's over there.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Professor Harries. My name is Adam Wagner, and I ask questions on behalf of the Clinically Vulnerable Families Group. First, I want to ask you about masks. You were asked by Ms. Carey earlier about the January 2022 roundtable discussion on RPE. And the minutes of that that you were shown say UK IPC guidance already enables the use of FFP3 in appropriate risk settings, and that further messaging may enable wider use where needed. Do you recall any discussion about whether the use of FFP3 masks should be enabled for patients, particularly those who are clinically vulnerable, in appropriate, that is, sort of high-risk settings, for example, attending hospitals or other healthcare environments?
So I think I made an earlier point here that people should be enabled to wear what they wish as long as it's safe, which I think is a broad point, but not directly answering the one you've made. That meeting was very much around advice to health care workers, I think not more broadly, but it did also pick up conversations about use of face coverings and masks for patients because of the importance around nosocomial infection. Yeah. But I think what you will have heard from other colleagues, probably more expert than me in this area, so Professor Hopkins and I think Sir Chris Whitty suggested pulled up some of the, I think there was no recommendation, including from the expert group from Dr. Shin and colleagues, to recommend anything other than FRSMs for patients. And there are a number of reasons for that. I think Professor Whitty flagged some of the issues of handling them, and also the issues of fit testing as well to make them very effective.
Yeah, and you said earlier that they should at least, if a patient comes in wanting to wear an FFP3 mask, they should be permitted as long as it's safe. And you said because it makes them feel safer. Would you agree that FFP3 masks, if fit tested, mean that the patient, a clinically vulnerable patient, is safer? They don't just feel safer, they are safer from contracting COVID or other respiratory illnesses?
Well, the evidence that we've, well, not necessarily myself today, but others have discussed here, is actually been very much around debating the effectiveness, differential effectiveness of different masks. And again, I would go back to this hierarchy of controls, because the thing which is most important to those individuals is that the setting that they're working in is sitting within that hierarchy of controls. PPE is just the very last step in that point. So I would be most concerned that hospitals were keeping up to step with all of the other areas. I mean, my point is I don't think we don't want to be, well, I certainly wouldn't want to be telling other people what to do when there is no harm associated with what it is that they're trying to do. There's a difference between feeling safe and effective PPE. And I think from our earlier conversations, I'm equally supportive that FRSMs, from the evidence that we have now in practice, are effective.
Sorry, can you just explain what you mean by that last comment?
Well, I'm not distinguishing between the evidence, for example, that I think Professor Hopkins gave, certainly others have, and including Dr. Shin and Co, that say the evidence of effectiveness in use, in clinical use, between FFP3s and FRSMs is very, very small. And so the same, I think, will apply to to individuals in the clinically extremely vulnerable group.
Just picking up the point about evidence, do you agree it's difficult, maybe even impossible, to obtain randomly controlled trial evidence in relation to the success or otherwise of FFP3 masks in hospital settings?
So I think, as I was saying earlier, and we were discussing some of the research proposals, in fact, one of the reasons that one of those research proposals has not gone through is because, and again, I think Professor Whitty said this actually, it probably needs to be looked at in a methodology called a randomised cluster trial, so that you get the right comparison. So yes, they are technically very difficult. Yes, UKHSA has put in to try and do some of those sorts of trials, but actually, this isn't, I think there's been some earlier sort of debate about whether everybody's looking for an RCT and therefore we should only look at observational studies. But in fact, the evidence, I think, which Dr. Shin provided was the meta-analysis, which included something like 21 observational studies. So broadly, the evidence has been the same from both the expert witnesses and from those who are working in the field. So I think the evidence can be explored more, and I think will be beneficial to everybody, whether it be healthcare workers, those providing guidance, or clinically extremely vulnerable individuals themselves.
Do you agree that there is a real risk if people are waiting for what would be the gold standard in, for example, drug trials of RCT evidence in relation to an area which you're just not going to get that, and yet there is a lot of observational evidence which comes out with a positive outcome?
Well, we always work on the best evidence that we have, and we're working from predominantly observational studies now, and the best evidence is in agreement between Dr. Shin, who was the expert, and colleagues who provided it, Dr. Hopkins, Chief Medical Officer. I'm not actually seeing difference in their views of effectiveness, and the majority of that evidence is currently on observational studies. I think it would be helpful to have some RCTs, and UKHSA is applying to try and promote that line of investigation.
Can I ask you about mask abuse? Are you aware that many clinically vulnerable people who choose to wear a face mask today have experienced mask abuse, so people being abusive towards them because they're wearing a mask?
I am aware of it, obviously, just from the media. I haven't had individuals that I know in that who are clinically extremely vulnerable experience it themselves, but I absolutely acknowledge it. But I mean, I think this is just any form of abuse is unacceptable.
Would it be a good idea to have some sort of public information campaign explaining to the general public that some people reasonably continue to wear masks today because they remain at higher risk of COVID-19, which continues to circulate?
So I think this is a much broader conversation. I mean, one of the things that has struck me in some of these conversations is that we're now with COVID at exactly the same place we are with flu or RSV or any other pathogens, and we will have groups of individuals across the population who, unfortunately for them, will always be at a slightly increased risk. So I think going out with a sort of specific COVID-19 wearing a mask campaign is probably not the right thing to do. Getting wider understanding of the risks of pathogens and how they can be prevented and how individuals can be supported is a really important thing to do. And that actually will feed in not only to supporting individuals in that group, but the public's understanding of how they could respond if we have another pandemic.
That could include mask wearing, couldn't it? Even if it's wider than COVID.
Many nations wear masks routinely. I mean, if you go to Korea in the flu season, routinely people will wear some sort of face covering.
So I don't think you're disagreeing that some sort of public information campaign of that kind, of that wider kind.
I don't think that was
good.
exactly what I was saying. What I think I was saying was educating the public so people are more accepting would be quite a positive thing to do, but I think it needs to be in a wider context and certainly not just in relation to COVID-19.
Can I ask you now about design of the shielding programme? Many of CVF's members who shielded found it practically impossible to socially distance from other members of their household, particularly, for example, if they had children and they were going off to school or a partner who was going to work. And there's evidence before this inquiry of them going to quite extreme lengths, like sleeping in a tent in the garden, on the most extreme scale. CVF has proposed, and you've been asked about this morning, this idea that the shielding support could have been extended in some cases to family members, for example, to allow a partner not to have to go to work, or a child not to have to go to school. And you said earlier, just quoting from what you said, once you start moving out to who needed support, it became very, very difficult to identify a household or a confirmed group or confined group. Do you mean by this that it would have been difficult to identify those people to give them the support, or was it something else?
So, as I think I said as well, SAGE actually did look at how one could achieve shielding effectively, and you will also have heard me say, when this programme went in, it was recognised that this was an imperfect way of supporting people, protecting them. So I think we were clear at the start that we were supporting to the best position we could, rather than necessarily ending with a perfect programme. Obviously, many of the support things, my role in this was very much about trying to identify those individuals that we thought were plausibly most at risk when we had very little information, and that has changed as well a little bit, since vaccination and with Q-COVID and our understanding of risk. The actual support elements sit with other parts of government, and that's not for me to opt out, but it wasn't for me to make those decisions. It was difficult, though, because in supporting them, I know there were many conversations about how it could be achieved. And one of the difficulties was actually there was always a connection somewhere. There was always somebody who needed support, or a family member, or something else. And to try and manage any further support equitably was quite challenging in itself in organisational terms. And I think you can see that coming through some of the email chains. You can see it was thought about. It wasn't followed through eventually. Yeah.
So it was really a practical issue rather than a principal issue, because it was about making sure you could have identified individuals who could straightforwardly identify themselves,
partly, but,
or be identified, or was it a principal issue?
Yes, I think in part, but equally, as I said, I think as you start extending out the group that you are trying to protect, actually, the sort of societal fabric starts to go. So if every single family, for example, is isolating indefinitely, systems start to fail, and it wasn't practical. And I think, this was very much, I realise, people picked up different messaging, but it was voluntary and supportive. And so in the end, I think it was felt that certain provision was made, and we recognised that wouldn't suit every single circumstance, but it was actually a very unusual, I think, internationally unique way of trying to support individuals with these conditions.
I just want to finish with healthcare-acquired infections. You've been over this morning, but obviously shielded people tended to access healthcare more than others. And often CVF members felt that their efforts to shield, which came with some very significant costs, were undermined because they had to leave their homes to access healthcare, where they were exposed to higher rates, and quite much higher rates of hospital and other healthcare-acquired infection. And that's described. There's an email which is in your bundle. You've not been shown. It's at tab 8. To Patrick Vallance, where it's described, in effect, the opposite of shielding, vulnerable or being preferentially infected. Do you agree that there was a failure to make it sufficiently safe for clinically vulnerable people to attend hospitals and other healthcare settings?
So there's some specific details about the data that email refers to, because in fact on that one, I think it was associated with some graphs where in fact, the mortality in hospitals was actually plateauing. So the interpretation in the email and the data, I think, is slightly misaligned. So I'd prefer not to do the detail of that email. But in relation to your actual question, I think that number one, as I explained earlier, we recognise that individuals, they're going to have to keep going to hospital. Many of them have conditions which require recurrent interventions, and that was why there was a specific paragraph around contacting your GP, so that if you did need to go, you were supported and encouraged to do in the safest way, and if you didn't need to go, you didn't expose yourself unnecessarily to some sort of routine checkup that he or she may have been able to provide differently. You'll also see that as shielding was stepped down, the guidance going out to trusts very much mentioned specific wards, so renal dialysis wards and wards where individuals were immunosuppressed and being treated were specifically named to encourage them to try and ensure that things like mask wearing and particular care was taken around infection. But I think, what we want to do is actually keep healthcare-associated infections down for everybody, and to some extent there are bound to be some in a pandemic. So this is about keeping everybody safe, including those who are clinically extremely vulnerable.
What concrete steps can be taken now to achieve that?
Well, I mean, routinely, we try, and I say we, NHS, but we support with data to try and keep healthcare-associated infections down. And that's, we have good data systems in this country. For example, I think it may be any minute now or tomorrow, something like that. The HCAI report goes out, so UKHSA monitors those infections frequently. We have continuous surveillance running, and we try and match that up with discussions with modelling with the NHS. But these are all the things that people have discussed about interventions to try and reduce that, and understanding where the infections are coming from. So again, we know from data that these were predominantly healthcare to healthcare and patient to patient. I mean, I think one of the important things for clinically extremely vulnerable is not because of them, because of the conditions they have, sometimes the viral load of an illness will continue for a longer period, and that's a really important point both for them and those working with them and caring for them that we need to try and flag.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner.
Thank you.
Ms. Waru. Over there.
Good afternoon, Professor. I represent 13 pregnancy, baby and parent organisations. Your comments on the draft maternity visiting guidance were particularly focused on the fact that testing couldn't eliminate risk. In hindsight, do you accept that testing support partners from the same household as a pregnant person could have sufficiently mitigated the risks of COVID-19 transmission, especially when balanced against the clear and direct risk to the health and well-being of the mother and baby of being alone during or after birth?
So I understand the thrust of your question, but I don't actually. The short answer would be no, because there is an objective, practical one, which is if you give somebody a test, will it remove all risk of COVID? No. The wider question is, can we prevent or absolutely minimise the risk of infection in a way which allows all of the positives around having a partner there and reduces all the negatives of ill health and feeling of ill support? And the answer to that is, I think we can do that much better. I commented, it was quite interesting which guidance come to me or not. I have a responsibility to flag, usually if they were coming to me, it was to flag what the clinical or technical risk was, and I have a responsibility to say that. There is a balance point for people to take and for hospitals to take, but it does go back to the point of two things. One is hierarchy of control. So, if your partner is super well trained and knows how to go in and out safely and all sorts of things, that's a much safer one, whether or not you've got a test even, than having somebody who's not used to that. And then the other point is, of course, local facilities are required to maintain the safety and the well-being of both the mums, their partners, but all the other mums, partners and babies as well. So this is why it's important locally that they do understand that. But the principle should be that for whether it be start of life or end of life, that there is good, normal, routine access, and that's assisted by some of the new testing technologies that we have.
Thank you, Professor, my lady.
Thank you very much. Sen Gupta, she's over there. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Harries. I represent the Frontline Migrant Health Workers Group. Our clients' members include outsourced non-clinical workers not directly employed by the NHS, such as hospital cleaners, porters, security guards and medical couriers. Our questions relate to occupational risk management and risk assessment in hospitals. Ms. Carey has already shown you the relevant passage of your evidence, and it's inquiry reference 489907, page 58. Please could that be displayed? This is paragraph 9.31 of your second statement in module 3. Thank you. In a single hospital setting, workers include those directly employed by the NHS Trust, nurses engaged by agencies, and other outsourced workers such as cleaners, porters and medical couriers who are engaged by private companies. And so employers responsible for workplace risk management for those workers include NHS trusts and private companies. Do you agree that this inevitably leads to inconsistent risk assessments and protections for those working in the same hospital?
It shouldn't, is the answer, because I think if you are running a hospital, and we're talking, I think, predominantly about infection control and transmission here, that hospital needs to control, if that means supporting individuals as well to do that, transmission within the hospital. I do recognise that this issue of who you are employed by and who you are looking to get that advice and support from can be challenging and disconnected. But the key point here is, to my mind, I mean, I'm coming from a COVID protection perspective. Actually, it is important that proactively anybody in that environment is able to have a conversation in a way which they understand and feel comfortable in, so that they can ask for the protection that they need or be advised what is available, and that is a COVID-secure environment.
Thank you. Professor, do you agree that at least during a pandemic, assessment of risk and risk management within hospitals is best conducted by a single employer who is subject to regulatory sanctions by the HSE in the event of a breach of health and safety law?
That I think is more difficult. It's not my expert area. I mean, there shouldn't be loopholes so that people end up being looked at in one space when they're working in another, because the combination of the role that somebody does and the risk management of the workplace is an important combination. So I think, it is critical. We found, I'll take a slightly different track, but for and I know Milady will be looking at this lately, but for care homes, actually, individuals, it's the same here, individuals who are supporting life services just as much as doctors or nurses, these places will not keep running, and yet actually often people will be on the lower employment ranks, they will be earning less, they will be doing 2 or 3 jobs, and these all start to become transmission risks. So I think I'm broadly supportive of what you're saying. I'm steering slightly away from the regulatory side because that's not my area of expertise.
Thank you. And finally, do you agree that the employer best placed to assess and manage risk to workers in a hospital setting is the organisation with direct experience and control of the hospital where the risk exists, i.e. the individual NHS trust?
So again, I mean, there are clearly both contractual and regulatory responsibilities. My position would be that it would be very difficult to run a safe hospital unless you are really sure of how risk is being managed in your employers within that work environment, because otherwise, how can you know your environment is safe? So I think it could be done by different ways, but very definitely, if I was heading up an acute trust, I would want to know all where my workers were and what that risk assessment was. And I think that's implicit in running a safe hospital.
And just building on that, doesn't that lead to the conclusion that the employer best placed to conduct that sort of risk assessment and risk management is the NHS Trust?
I think that depends on how systems are. I mean, there are very, very many different setups, so I don't want to be pinned into one particular place. You might have a group of trusts. You might have a local system where an individual knows the different trusts and is acting on their behalf. So I think that is much more difficult. But the principle that individuals both should be protected in any environment they're in, but also that the owner, if you like, who's responsible for the workplace should understand that in order to deliver a safe environment, are both agreed with.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, milady.
Thank you very much. Mr Stanton, the staff is behind you, but if you can make sure your answers go into the microphone. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor. I asked questions on behalf of the British Medical Association. I'd like to refer you to a UK HSA paper, which is reference INQ 000338440, which should be before you can see it is. This is a paper that I think your scientist colleagues prepared in response to a rapid review of AGPs that was carried out by NHS England. And I just want to quickly refer you to a sentence on page 2, which reads, there is an increasing evidence base of aerosol measurements during normal respiratory activities such as tidal breathing, breathing during exercise, talking, shouting and singing. And then take you quickly to the 3 conclusions on the 4th page, please. And actually, I just want to reference the first 2 conclusions. The first one is, in the absence of robust evidence, the precautionary principle should apply before potentially removing protections from staff and patients. And then the second conclusion, this AGP review highlights the production of aerosols by normal respiratory activity in a graded and proportionate way, and importantly, this physiological respiratory aerosol has been demonstrated to contain SARS-CoV-2 in patients with COVID-19. The logical consequence of this conclusion is that those delivering close care to patients with suspected or confirmed COVID-19 should be provided with the highest grade of respiratory protection. And I'd just like to ask you briefly whether you agree with the conclusions expressed there by your scientists.
So I think, if I'm correct, this was a review, and I was also provided a note as the Chief Executive because there was a debate. I think there was a document, a review done by the IPC cell, and some of my colleagues in UKHSA were less comfortable, I think, with the idea that some of the procedures should come off the list. So I think this is predominantly about AGPs, and I think the only thing I would just pull here is I think the graded and proportionate way around respiratory activity, I think that is a debate. It may have come through some of these, but it's quite variable, both between different procedures, aerosol generation procedures, and between different individuals. And I think that's an area where I've already flagged there should be more work. But broadly, I was supportive of the fact that I felt this should be flagged to the IPC cell, and indeed it was with my permission.
You mentioned in your answer that some of your colleagues were less comfortable, I think you might have said, with the initial review that was conducted on behalf of the IPC cell. Can I just ask you quickly about that as well? The conclusions of your scientists are in contrast to the approach taken by the IPC cell. Would it be fair to say there was a difference of view between the IPC cell and some of your scientists on this issue?
So I think if you look back at a lot of the evidence that's come to the inquiry, there are times when the scientists are saying something different. And in fact, the scientists, even if we think about Professor Beggs at the start of this, is saying something different somewhere else. So number one, there is definitely not groupthink because there's quite a lot of noise. Number two, I think there is a differential, which I was trying to say, which is the IPC cell is providing, if you like, a manual, an operational manual. We are providing the science input. I think one of the questions that arises is at which point do I or my colleagues shout really, really, really loudly if we think this is inappropriate. In this particular case, if I remember, the broad principle was maintained, but a couple of AGP procedures were removed from the list. And my point there is, I think this is very difficult territory. We need really, really good research, and that is exactly what we should do.
Can I really quickly ask you, just finally, your view about whether the UK IPC cell should have responded more quickly to the emerging threat of aerosol transmission?
So this goes back, I think, to the effectiveness. So what is the thing that they should have done? And I don't actually think that any of the experts either feeding, that the inquiry has called, or others feeding in, are saying that there is strong evidence of a different approach to the guidance that's there from the IPC at the moment. This was specifically about AGPs, I think. I think you're asking both a content and time issue. So I think the content is we have an agreed position. We think we could do better with evidence, and we should generate that. In timing, I'd have to look back, I'm afraid, at the precise timing in which they responded. So I would rather pass on that one and come back to you if I need to.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Burton, who's at the back there. And if, when you're being polite by looking at Mr. Burton, you could...
I'll look
as you were looking at Mr. Stanton, we lost you a bit.
Yeah, good afternoon, Professor Harries. Please don't feel obliged to look this way at all. Please just address her ladyship when I'm asking you these questions. I ask questions on behalf of the Disability Charities Consortium, which you may be familiar with, and I'm going to be asking questions exclusively about the shielding programme. And with one exception, I'm going to be asking questions about the contents of your witness statement, your first one. So if you want to look at that at any point, please feel free to do so. Professor, at paragraph 49 of that statement, you say that on the 26th of April 2020, you provided advice by email to DHSC on the shielding programme and possible growth of the group asked to shield. And counsel to the inquiry asked you some questions about that process earlier. In particular, that advice was provided by you in response to an email from James Rogers of the Cabinet Office, which I think had been forwarded to you by Antonia Williams. It might be helpful just to briefly look at that. This is the only document I'm going to ask the witness to look at, my lady, which is at 000151804, page 2. And you'll see there that Mr. Rogers was asking for an assessment of each proposed addition to the SPL against, amongst other things, net health, including socioeconomic status and fairness. And in relation to fairness, Mr. Rogers said at paragraph B3 of his email, on fairness impacts, we should thoroughly consider the differential impacts on different groups, both those with protected characteristics and other groupings, such as socioeconomic background or location. This work will need to inform a public sector equality duty assessment for ministers. Professor, as far as you know, was each proposed addition to the SPL considered in the way Mr. Rogers had requested in relation to socioeconomic factors and protected characteristics in particular?
I haven't got the questions in front of me. I've just got the front page, but I think I understand I remember the content of this. So at the 24th of April, the SPL was a conditions-based list. That was how it was done on the clinical grounds of whether there was a plausible likelihood of an individual suffering significantly because of the condition that they had. So many of the questions that have been asked for here were just not derivable at that point. There wasn't sufficient evidence. What we did do, though, and that was the whole point of Q-COVID, was to, as evidence arose, to move on, and the list was updated, and conditions around location, for example, or deprivation and protected characteristics were brought into Q-COVID, and that's why more people were added. And in fact, when we got to some of the additions, and I think it may have been evidence that was presented to Professor Whitty, we could see that, for example, there was a much higher proportion of ethnic minority individuals brought in because they got picked up on this intersectional consideration. But at this time, it actually wasn't possible to do that because it was primarily a conditions-based initial list.
Just in relation to Q-COVID, do you know if disability in particular was ever one of the considerations in relation to Q-COVID?
So the conditions were... So disabilities is a really interesting... But I might go back to the recommendation about data, because the data, as it's difficult talking away, but I'm sure the data, as you know, is really difficult. So some conditions which will be counted on that will have appeared in the in our original conditions-based list. And then as the Q-COVID data was generated effectively, we could see various conditions coming through. So I used the example of Down syndrome, where the initial run of the Q-COVID, there was very little signal early on. When the initial run, the test data went through, if you like, on the initial run for Q-COVID, we could see that there was a signal from Downs. And then when we got that through, you could see that this was a strong signal, and those with Down syndrome were moved into this into the Q-COVID list and into the CEV. So it was, but it was considered on different areas. And disability, of course, is recorded in many different ways for different conditions and means different things. And that's one reason why the data is so difficult to incorporate.
Thank you very much. I think I know from your previous answer what your answer is likely to be to the next question, but I just need to ask it for formality's sake anyway, if that's okay. Just following on from Mr. Rogers' email, do you know if any public sector equality duty assessment of the shielding policy was ever actually undertaken?
I can't remember offhand, but it would be very unusual for something not to take place. And I know from the data that we looked at, although it's difficult to evaluate the effectiveness, which is clearly part of the outcome, should be part of that duty as well. The characteristics of the group were clearly described, and then when we got into, as I say, the Q-COVID, we could see intentionally that we had higher representation than we had previously from ethnic minorities. We had differential geographical representation, for example, which was, although we were challenged on, I think it was entirely consistent with where there were health conditions differentially, disproportionately affecting populations, particularly, for example, in, I think it was Newham, Tower Hamlets, various other areas where we know there was high deprivation.
Sorry to pin you down a little bit, Professor, but I think your answer therefore was you're not sure, but you'd be surprised if there hadn't been one.
Well, the Department of Health would have been responsible for it, but I know, I know from the work that we did, we looked at different characteristics. So whether you call that a formal PSCD or whether you're, I'm very happy to confirm that we looked at those characteristics in detail. I wasn't the one responsible for putting in a formal response back to government, but it was monitored very carefully.
I'm most grateful, thank you. At paragraph 55 of your statement, you cite further advice you gave to DHC somewhat later on the 31st of October 2020. And you very helpfully cited some of that advice after paragraph 55. And I just want to ask you about two bits of that advice that you cited there. Towards the bottom of the page, you say, we should continue to rapidly include those additional groups already identified by the clinical panel at increased risk and not yet included in the SPL. CKD5 and Downs. This work has been paused by CEO, but there is clinical agreement with NHSE that work should proceed apace on Monday unless other factors preclude this. Now, I think the decision to add those with Downs to the SPL had been made somewhat earlier in September. Can we take it from your advice then that as of 31st of October 2020, those with Downs still hadn't been added to the SPL list?
So we'd looked at this, as I just noted, that there was an early signal, but with not very granular data back in June. We had taken that too. So there was a clinical review panel, which I would chair, and then we take that for decision to the UK CMOs. Their consideration at the time said actually that individuals should be added on an individual basis because we didn't have sufficient data to really make forward a strong recommendation to say that everybody with Downs, for example, should be on that list. But actually, when we ran the data, the Q-COVID data, formally with all of the updates, we could see that there was a strong signal, and that was the clinical panel's recommendation and the UK CMO's decision. The actual processing of that going into the list, for all of the reasons which I explained earlier on the data and the connectivity, was a responsibility that went back through DHSC and NHS Digital. So my assumption would be that they were working on it. I was really saying here that there is clinical agreement that we strongly support that.
I'm most grateful. And then just further to that, then, you would agree...
Your last question, I'm afraid, Mr Burton. I'm really sorry.
Well, Madam, I haven't got through the questions I've been given permission to ask.
No, but you were given, I'm afraid you were given 8 minutes, and we're really tight for time.
Very well. Well, I'll skip the next question and ask another one, if I may. If you could look again just at that advice, please, you'll see at the bottom of it, it says, in addition, advice should be that those on the SPL do not provide childcare or other caring arrangements, even though these are permitted more generally. Do you see that?
Yep.
Do you know if that advice was actually given?
So the advice finally would go back, as I noted earlier, it was Cabinet Office advice, and I would provide a clinical view. It wasn't my final decision, but the rationale sitting behind this was to try to protect individuals. Obviously, we wanted, and you can see here, recognition of the fact that there were significant mental health considerations and physical for people who were shielding for a long time, but actually multiple childcare arrangements, for example, could actually be quite challenging in terms of transmission control. I think it was actually, I'm just trying to connect the timeframes because I think this links to the bubbling conversation later on, where there was a recommendation to bubble, but again, not to bubble more widely.
And my lady, if I might just ask one very quick follow-up.
No, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to stop. I'm sorry, Mr Burton. We had intended to call Dame Jenny tomorrow. We can't because of, sadly, she has to go to a funeral. So I'm afraid I'm just going to have to cut you short. I'm really sorry.
Thank you.
Ms Shepherd.
Good afternoon, Professor Harries. I appear on behalf of COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. The first question I was going to ask you is going to be, do you accept that the IPC guidance did not have sufficient measures to adequately address the risk of aerosol transmission? You were asked that earlier by Mr Stanton, and I think the answer that you gave was what should they have done? Well, the evidence of the IPC experts, who were Professors Gould and Doctors Shin and Warren, gave a couple of recommendations. They were HEPA filters, the portable HEPA filters, UV lights, improved ventilation, and they advised that FFP3 respirators should have been used on a precautionary basis when treating COVID patients and patients with suspected COVID-19. Do you agree that those recommendations weren't in the IPC guidance issued?
I'm just trying to process your question. Ventilation, I absolutely support, but that is, again, that comes with understanding more of the transmission as our evidence base developed. But it's that goes whether it's in hospitals or other areas. And I think again, Sir Chris Whitty mentioned the point about there are risks with that as well around thermal regulation as well for different. So we need. It's not quite as clear as it is. On the evidence that we were discussing, which Dr. Shin and colleagues presented, again, I'm just repeating what I've said. I think nobody has suggested that the actual practical evidence of wearing FFP3s is significantly better than wearing FRSMs, except for the AGPs that we were just discussing. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I think it's probably the same answer I gave before.
Very quickly, you asked earlier what were the things they should have done that they didn't. I was just giving you some examples of the evidence that we've heard in the inquiry. Do you agree that that should have been implemented?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Apologies if I'm not...
I'll move on. Earlier in this inquiry, Sir Frank Atherton, who's the CMO for Wales, gave evidence that he assumed that long-range aerosol transmission was taking place and that it was understood from quite early on that there's a continuum of droplets to tiny particles. Did you understand that as well at the early stage of the pandemic?
So I think obviously it depends at what time he thought long-range air transmission was happening and in what proportion. So the issue is not whether there was some air transmission. It is how much, what proportion, how far. And I think I've probably answered that question previously. So I think any respiratory virus, we would always think, is there some air transmission? But our evidence from previous SARS and MERS in practical clinical utilisation and transmission prevention was that wasn't the predominant route. I think obviously evidence has changed now.
In relation to the issue about predominant route, it also wasn't known at the time whether droplet and fomite transmission was predominant at the beginning of the pandemic, but you wouldn't remove measures in relation to droplet and fomite. So do you agree that if there is some evidence of aerosol transmission and it wasn't known to the extent of the aerosol transmission, that it should have been assumed that it was taking place and that it was a predominant route?
So I think I just repeat what I've said previously, which is it was a reasonable assumption to go to the nearest relative in the viral chain, look at what had happened in clinical practice, because this is important as well. That's where guidance started. Yes, we should always stay open to changes in proportion of transmission routes and risks, and we need to manage those. But I don't think it wasn't an unreasonable assumption at the start.
In your witness statement, you talk about the role that you had, which was effectively to flag any issues that you saw in the IPC guidance, but that wasn't necessarily your primary role. You were looking at if there were any interferences with other parts of guidance. Did you ever flag any issues with the IPC guidance or challenge it?
Yes. But I'd struggle to be, we've seen some, it's not just IPC guidance, it's guidance, full stop. And I would get guidance, for example, from BEIS and flag differences in the way things have been described to ensure there was consistency across. But these would be multiple documents on a daily basis flying through the office. So that's quite a broad question.
If I could make it more specific, did you ever say that there needs to be more in this IPC guidance to address the risk of aerosol transmission?
Well, I would have been looking at the control of transmission as a whole, and it would obviously, that would depend on the evidence we had available at any particular time as to whether I would or would not have been flagging it. Obviously, at the start of it, I think I've just said that the transmission through air was recognised potentially, but was not thought to be a major route. So I would not have been focused on that specific at the start. Clearly, as the guidance went through, I can think many occasions where I put in the word ventilation in the middle of things as the guidance and the evidence developed. But these are multiple. There's probably hundreds of documents, so I think I'd need a slightly more precise question. Sorry to be more helpful.
I'll move on to my next topic, which is aspects of divergence between England and Wales. In late April 2020, the Minister for Health in England announced an expansion of the rapid antigen testing programme to include asymptomatic healthcare workers and NHS patients. When the announcement was made, Sir Frank Atherton said that the Welsh Government was still trying to reach across to England to understand the exact rationale for the changes that they've made in various categories. To your knowledge, did Sir Frank Atherton or anyone else from Welsh Government reach across to understand the rationale for the expansion?
I wasn't involved with test and trace at the time, so I can't answer from that perspective. I can say that Frank Atherton, I routinely joined conversations with all of the DCMOs, CMOs from all of the nations, as I think others have described. And we would have had conversations through that and through the senior clinicians group as various changes were being managed. So I think in general that was it. It's not clear from your question whether that relates to a practical issue about tests, test availability, which I could find out for you for a later module. I think. I'm sorry, I'm not very able to help more.
What Sir Frank Atherton said in his oral evidence was that testing was a bit of an issue, and that although information on the public health basis flowed very smoothly between the CMOs, sometimes at the policy level in England, they didn't communicate as rapidly as he would have liked with colleagues who are working on similar issues in Wales. And he says that that did lead to some divergence and some difficulties in keeping up with what everybody was doing. Were you aware of any of those difficulties in communication?
I don't really think this is a question, with my lady's permission, I don't think this is a question for this particular module. There will be a testing module. I can provide information historically that I receive on behalf of the test and trace, but it feels like that's a question for DHSC policy, possibly in a different module.
But there's a legitimate point, Michelle, but I probably should have thought about that more when I gave permission.
There's just my final question is about testing, so therefore, my lady, I'll raise that in the next module. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Shepherd. I'm very grateful. Mr Pisani, who's over there.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Professor. I ask questions on behalf of Mind, the mental health charity. The first topic has already been raised with you, Professor, by Ms Carey, counsel to the inquiry, and it's in relation to the document published by PHE on the 29th of March 2020 called Guidance for the Public on the Mental Health and Wellbeing Aspects of the Coronavirus. The reference is INQ 00034891. My questions in relation to that are, first, children and young people's mental health was not expressly addressed in the guidance published on the 29th of March 2020. Given that A, known risk factors to their mental health include disrupted schooling and social isolation, and B, the guidance did expressly address another age category, that of older people, are you able to assist on why there was no specific reference to children and young people's mental health in that guidance?
So I'll say two things. One is I can't say the origins. I wasn't in Public Health England at the time,
Sure.
and I didn't draft the guidance.
Sure.
So what I can say is, as DCMO, I did link a lot, and I think that is, I've provided some evidence of that with the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. The CMOs obviously provided that for CMO's position for education, and I recognise all the points that you make. I think it's probably become much clearer to everybody through the last few months just how difficult it's been for children and for mental health, and how enduring some of that difficulty has been. I don't think it was necessarily anticipated at the start, and I think your point about always ensuring that children are considered in guidance is a really important one. I think there was separate guidance for children, which I would just flag, but I don't have that to hand to show you.
I'm very grateful. The second point is similar, but in relation to eating disorders. Similar risk factors apply, and much of what you've already said in your answer to my first question would also apply to eating disorders, as I'm sure you're very well aware. And also, a later version of the guidance did expressly address eating disorders as a specific category of groups with additional mental health needs. And it said, and it's worth just noting briefly what it said, if you have an eating disorder or struggle with your relationship with food, you may be finding aspects of the current situation particularly challenging, for example, the reduced availability of specific foods, social isolation, and significant changes to your routine. But the first version of the guidance in March 2020 did not mention eating disorders at all. Again, are you able to assist on the reason for that omission early on in the pandemic?
So again, this is not, it's not an area, I wasn't responsible for the guidance, I wasn't in that organisation. And in fact, as we've progressed, that advice now would come from the Office of Health Improvement and Disparities, not from UK Health Security Agency. Nevertheless, I'm a general public health physician, so I think the point that you make is an important one. I think again it would have been difficult to know at the start of the pandemic. We had no understanding of how long this was going to go on, how the waves would form, what the impact and timing would be on education and the impact on children. So I think these are important considerations to learn for any other potential future lockdowns, if I dare use the word, but really important. And actually the most important thing is about the services now. Again, not my responsibility, but I know is recognised because services have been strained for many years. And actually, if children are not recovering quickly, there will be an ongoing significant demand. And I think that's probably an important one to ask NHSE colleagues.
Thank you. I don't want to overuse my time, so I will ask you this. You said to Ms. Carey before lunch, and I hope I got your evidence down right from the transcript, the mental health impact, and I think you were talking about shielding then and lockdown. The mental health impact was to some extent recognised. My question is, why to some extent?
Well, I think I gave the answer then because we don't it was recognised on an ongoing basis. So if I think about clinically extremely vulnerable or other groups, people were surveyed through the pandemic. ONS produced regular updates. So as I say, to the extent that those surveys showed evidence, then that's there. But for something like an eating disorder, that can be actually hidden for large amounts of it, and it may not surface until children are back in different societal fora. So I think it's inevitable that some of these things will surface through the pandemic, and not all were predictable.
I see. So your point is delayed emergence of evidence for the mental health impact.
And the fact that, unless you put in very specific studies for different cohorts of people or what have you, will always have hidden pockets of illness or ill health, which you can't quantify or qualitatively explain in detail until a specific piece of work's there. So I think I was probably just saying there is a general recognition, and I think we can all see that. We could see that through the clinically extremely vulnerable, although actually the mental health levels, the reported downturn in mental health was probably not too dissimilar to actually what the general population reported as well. So I think, it will have affected different individuals in different ways, and some of that also will depend on their own individual home circumstances. So it was a general comment, really, but I think recognise the importance of mental health.
I'm very grateful.
Thank you, Mr. Pisani. Ms. Munro, just there, much more convenient.
It's on. Thank you. Good afternoon, Professor Harries. My name is Alison Munro, and I ask questions on behalf of COVID bereaved families for Justice UK. I'd like firstly to take you back to a document you've been referred to a number of times already this afternoon. Hopefully I have different questions in relation to that. It's the January 2022 roundtable that you attended. And looking at the summary of notes, the purpose of that roundtable, amongst other things, was for those participants to understand and discuss the current evidence base regarding RPE usage, guidance, how the guidance is being implemented in practice, and what the practical considerations are regarding RPE uses, such as fit testing and supply. Now, that's January 2022. However, the concerns about availability and use of FFP3 masks for healthcare workers treating COVID patients were being raised from the outset of the pandemic, which I'm sure, Professor, you were aware of at the time. What was your involvement in addressing such concerns prior to this roundtable in January 22?
So I didn't have a direct involvement. As I try to say, usually if there were tricky topics or areas involving individuals representing large parts of the health or care system or local government, then often I would be used as a chairperson, if you, I mean, very willingly, but because I had insight into each of those different areas of work rather than just one part of the system. So originally I would have been, in fact, very little, to be honest. My role as Deputy CMO was theoretically, prior to the pandemic, to do with health improvement work, so nutrition, physical activity, and those sorts of things. And I reverted to health protection, obviously in response to the pandemic. So I think the reason this particularly arose by that stage, I was the Chief Executive of the UK Health Security Agency. Clearly, I had professionals now working in my new organisation who were inputting to the IP cell. The first event actually after the formation of UKHSA was the Omicron wave, and that had triggered a number of conversations to come back up to the top. So in some ways it was an opportunity for all of those people in a new wave with a new health protection system to say, actually, what do we all think here? Are we all understanding the evidence the same? Are there issues here? Can we have a single voice around what's there, or are there things that we need to do to improve the position?
Thank you. The summary notes of the meeting also state that the evidence relating to RPE was accrued up to April 2020 and pre-Omicron. There may be value in revisiting this work. My question, was the work revisited, and had further evidence been sought post-April 2020?
One of the reasons actually for chairing the roundtable, which I think I'd flagged or suggested just before Christmas, was to check. It was this whole position of, well, this is what the evidence was before. Has the evidence changed? And so when people came to that, I would have to go and check. I mean, PHE and then UKHSA will routinely update evidence. There's usually a time frame attached to a piece of evidence, but the pandemic was fast-moving. As we've all discussed, the transmission routes were being considered, and the proportion of airborne transmission was being considered. So it was important to ask. So that was one of the topics that was discussed, because each of those contributors came from a different background, so they would have brought with them the science side of things, what utilisation was right, what healthcare workers were seeing or feeling on the ground, a whole range of different potential evidence bases. And if there were gaps, then we could take that away and review it.
Thank you. And finally, on this roundtable meeting, amongst the outcomes of the roundtable was further consideration of fit testing in the context of pandemic preparedness. Can you, Professor, comment on the work done since the roundtable, since January 22, either by UKHSA or others, in regards to A, RPE and transmissibility of COVID, and B, fit testing?
So the transmissibility and the use of RPE goes back to the conversations around our research programme, and I'm going to provide the lady with some detail of that. So there is work ongoing. The fit testing is much more of an operational issue for NHS, so I suggest that might be a question that you might want to keep for when colleagues are on the stand in the near future.
Thank you. One question on another topic, testing of asymptomatic patients and healthcare workers. I want to refer you to another meeting that you attended. It was a senior clinicians meeting at which a paper was discussed on nosocomial transmission. For reference, it's in your statement at INQ 0004899907. Now, the paper that was discussed was drafted by NHS England to SAGE and dated the 31st of March 2020, and it identified risk, including the risk of transmission by asymptomatic patients or staff, and noted that swabbing of healthcare workers and or asymptomatic patients was a potential surveillance and research option, which had already been underway in Bristol. With that in mind, and in view of this early recognition of the risks posed by asymptomatic transmission and potential for addressing it, do you consider that such testing of healthcare workers, which was not implemented until November of 2020, was properly prioritised, particularly in advance of the second wave in October of that year?
I would have to check some of the detail in my notes, but I think the sequence of events was that paper was, I don't have it in front of me, but I recognise it had a number of different areas of potential opportunity to intervene. And so there were two issues. One was actually the testing capacity, and I think that was the prime reason, but there was also research which started, and in fact, the Siren study, which I've mentioned earlier, picked up some of that, so that it gave an opportunity. I think it came in before the actual testing, it was a research protocol. But the real problem with testing at the early part of the pandemic was actually the capacity. So it was clinical use first for management of patients, and then obviously healthcare workers and their families and social care workers as well and key workers were the next priority.
Thank you. My final question relates to lessons learned and data systems. Now, we've heard a lot about data. You've spoken at length about it. Your answers have touched upon my question. So the remnants of the question that I have left, I can probably summarise as follows. It's abundantly clear, Professor, how important and significant you place data, and it's a view that we share. In the event of another pandemic, we're going to need to hit the ground running and be in a position that data is used better and is utilised better, and that there are mechanisms to facilitate its use and rapid implementation, etc., for policies such as perhaps a future shielding policy. What is being done now to prepare and ensure that we're in the best possible position to utilise data effectively and efficiently?
So obviously there are many different owners or custodians, I would say. The data is provided often by the individual, so it's their test, it's their infection, it's whatever it might be. But we are careful custodians of a lot of public data, particularly on infectious diseases. So in UKHSA now, we will receive in automatically signals of, to monitor, survey different infections, so COVID variants or what have you. We have taken action because what happened during COVID was that a lot of new systems were set up quite quickly, patched together. They were quite expensive systems, and they were only specific for COVID. So we don't have most of those systems now. I think this is an important understanding. So if you absolutely said this happens this minute, I cannot do what we've provided for dashboards and things to the extent that we did before. But we are trying to now build systems which are pathogen agnostic. And so not only could we pick up use those for any new emerging infection, but much more routinely, we can provide information to the public so they can see as well. I mean, one of the important things about the dashboard was once it was up and running, actually people responded to the waves that they saw. And so to some extent, the advice we give can be, there will be routine evidence. And we are doing that now. It's a little bit, it's crude at the moment, but we're trying to put out new systems for the public to use. And if you go on the UKHSA website, you will see that for winter viruses at the moment. So we are doing work, but there is a history, I think, of a lack of investment in digital infrastructure across the public system. And that comes with security as well, which is obviously a changing environment. So it's quite a slow progress, but there is work.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Miss Munro. And Miss Hannah, who's right at the back there. I think she's trying to make your life difficult, was the last question.
Thank you, my lady. Professor Harris, I ask questions on behalf of the long COVID groups. I ask you first of all about UXA's work. The latest publicly available data on the prevalence of long COVID was published by ONS in March 2024, and that reported that nearly 2 million people, or 3.3% of the population of England and Scotland, are self-reporting with long COVID. What work is UXA currently doing on communicating the risks of long COVID to the public?
So predominantly the risk of long COVID and the clinical interventions are managed by the NHS through NHSE. So broadly we we don't transmit risk because what we will include those risks along with the risks of the pathogen itself. So I think in our, for example, in things like vaccination, where we know of vaccine effectiveness, we will show in public communications the evidence that we have in relation to reductions in long COVID, alongside those reductions in prevalence of disease.
Is the answer to that then generally no, nothing, save for when it...
Well, I think this is a distribution of responsibility. So it's not that we don't recognise the significance of the disease. It's more to do with different parts of the health system and the responsibilities we have. So we will monitor vaccine uptake, for example. We will look at associations of effectiveness of vaccine in a number of different ways. You know, preventing serious illness, preventing long COVID, a number of those areas. But it's not probably our place. It's more in the clinical research area of clinical trials with NIHR, with the Department of Health and NHS England to look at some of the other parameters.
Can I just ask you about long COVID and young people? The UK Chief Medical Officers, of which at the time you were one, put out a statement on the 23rd of August 2020 on schools and childcare reopening. And in that statement, you said very few, if any, children or teenagers will come to long-term harm from COVID-19, due solely to attending school. That statement was issued at a time, August 2020, when a number of my clients' children had already developed debilitating and disabling symptoms of long COVID and were being disbelieved by medical practitioners. So the August 2020 statement didn't warn parents of the risk of long COVID in children. When did the Office of the Chief Medical Officers provide such a warning?
So I think I'd probably refer to the evidence that Professor Chris Whitty gave. Obviously, I left that office in April 21, and as I think he said, we are still learning a lot about this, and I'm sure you are very familiar with that. I think there were lots of things that were really difficult and bad about the pandemic, and the balance of impact on children is really difficult. I think we've just had a colleague speaking from Mind about the mental health impact. So it's very difficult to, there are lots of things in that statement that have not been flagged, and there is a lot of learning ongoing. So I think there's an absolute recognition that in a small number of children there will be really, really significant impacts. It is still the case that the impact of COVID severity is still very much with the elderly, and you can see that in the outcomes.
Professor, do you accept that having put out that statement in August 2020, it was incumbent on the Office of the Chief Medical Officer to flag the risk of long COVID in a subsequent statement?
I think it would have been very difficult to do that in August. I mean,
I'm not talking about August, Professor, I'm talking about subsequently once the risk of long COVID to children became apparent.
Well, I would struggle to answer, I think, on behalf of the Chief Medical Officer, because I think you posed a similar question to him when he was here, and it's his office now and it's not mine. So I think the broad question, I think, is, are we aware of those risks? Yes. Is it well known amongst the medical profession and among health services? Yes. And for my own organisation, we do use that as not specifically for children, obviously, but we do say that the reduction in when we're using vaccine data, we will use the evidence about reductions in long COVID where we have it as part of the opportunity that's available to the public of all ages from the reduction in incidence of COVID and therefore of long COVID.
Can I just put the point another way? Would you do anything different now, in your time as Deputy Chief Medical Officer, to offer reassurance to parents of children with long COVID?
Well, I think we're talking now about a document that I think went out in August 2020, when I don't think we were only a few months after the start of the pandemic, and the long COVID syndromes were not well described and understood, and that's obviously because it has a long time frame. So I don't think it would have been possible to say very much more at that time. Clearly, the approach for everybody is there are lots of negative things about COVID. We want to reduce them, and the more we reduce the incidence of COVID, the less long COVID there will be.
Melanie.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hannah. I think that completes the questions that we have for you. I think the last time we met, you had to go off to deal with, was it an Mpox outbreak?
There's another Mpox outbreak.
Exactly, you have another one. And I heard a case of avian flu this morning. So I hope that your organisation isn't overwhelmed with cases and that you manage to get them all under control. Thank you for your help. I think you may well, during the course of answering Ms Shepherd, have volunteered to help the inquiry again in another module. But we'll try to limit the burden we place on the UK HSA. But thank you for your help today. Very well. 10 o'clock tomorrow, and I understand the tube strike has been called off.
It has, my lady.
So travel arrangements back to normal, however good that may be. Thank you very much.
All rise.